everybody. Mark Schaftlein with you, and this is the Schaftlein Report, Monday's edition. And as always on Monday, we've got lots of topics to go over, but today we're going to bring something that's been really in the news for the past couple days. And today, with the Supreme Court ruling, three key topics on education come to mind, and we could not have anyone more qualified to be with us today. I'd like to welcome Dr. Greene to the Schaftlein Report. Dr. Vermelle Greene, happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Hey, listen, I want to, as we get going with our show today, I want you to talk about your organization, okay, about the boys, okay, because that's the integral part of the education right now. You're the executive director of the Boys Initiative, and can you tell our audience a little bit about what that is and your background in education?
Absolutely. I've been in education really, oh my goodness, I started in 1974, and for those of you who are good at math, that makes me about 42.
Okay, love it. You started very young.
But yes, over 47 years in education, and I kept seeing our boys failing, and at first I didn't know what was going on. At the bottom of test scores and at the top of suspension and expulsion rates. And just before I retired from the public school system, I began to do some research and found out something that I was never schooled in. I was never trained in. First of all, that boys learn differently than girls. That boys, the way their brains process information is different from the way the girls' information is processed. And then I look at schools that are predominantly dominated by female teachers who are going to teach the way that they learn, and it's connecting with the girls, not so much with the boys. And when I retired, I said, well, you know what? I want to do something about this. And I began to put together a plan for a school for boys to teach them the way that they learn. And the boys there thrive. We made sure that we incorporated developmental and academic strategies that reached boys. For example, something as simple as having 2 recesses every day. Oh, my boys loved it because boys are wired for movement. Also, the fact that boys are very visual. So we wanted to make sure that our reading material, our curricula, had lots of pictures and interesting things. And the books that they read in our library, we didn't have too many copies of Little House on the Prairie or fairy tales and unicorns. No, our boys wanted to read about bugs and grossness and Guinness Book of World Records and 10-inch fingernails, scratching people and monsters that ate New York. Those are the kind of things that our boys wanted to read about. We wanted to make sure that we changed everything.
Dr. Greene, what were the age groups of the boys you're referring to, and why was it that the girls were advancing faster than the boys? What did you learn about that when you did your research?
Well, first of all, our school was kindergarten to grade 8.
Okay.
We started with kindergarten to grade 8, and someone once asked me, well, when are you going to do something for the girls? And I said, well, this is for the girls. We're training up educated young men who know how to treat their wives and their daughters, who know how to take care of themselves. And with our girls are doing well, especially in the language arts. But our boys, the way that their brain process information, reading and writing can be a challenge for them. Now, I'm speaking in generalities. A lot of our boys do great in those areas. But generally speaking, not so much.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, please, finish up. Yeah.
I was saying that, unfortunately, our boys don't have the advocacy groups that our girls had. Back in the 1980s, when girls weren't doing too well in math and science, oh my goodness, the feminists came out en masse to say, no, we need to change things. Our girls need to be elevated in math and the sciences and in engineering. And so all of these colleges began to have special programs, and curricula began to be changed. Math became more than just numbers and computation. They started to put more language into math because that's where the female brain has an advantage. So it wasn't good enough to know that 2 plus 2 was 4. You had to be able to explain why 2 plus 2 was 4. You had to have word problems. You had to have more reading about math and writing about math. And so the girls began to do well, which is fine.
Sure.
I want the girls to do well. I used to be a little girl. I want them to do well. But that doesn't mean that because the girls do well, the boys have to do worse. Help the boys. They don't have the advocacy groups that the girls have. So now that boys are floundering at the bottom of test scores, as I said, but at the top of suspension and expulsion rates, not just in our area, not just in America, but this is an international problem. Our boys are not doing as well as their female peers.
This is really interesting because we've had a lot of people in the last, I'd say month and a half come on the show. Education's been a prime topic we've talked about. And this is the first time this subject's come up. I mean, we're talking about all kind of different things related to education, which we'll get into some of that today. But this is the first time I've ever heard that concept about young men falling behind young women and why some of that took place. And so when you did your research, did some of the public schools adopt these changes that you were successfully able to implement when you sort of did the test case studies yourself?
I've done workshops for countless public schools and private schools, Christian schools as well. But unfortunately, there is still that thread out there that says, no, boys don't need the help. Look at corporations. They're all dominated by men. And it's the girls that need the help. It's the girls that are doing well. But you know what? I like that phrase. Data don't lie. Look at the data. Look at the data. And as parents would go to their school boards and say, can you please disaggregate the data? Don't just have, test scores. Disaggregate it, boys and girls. And let's see how the boys are doing compared to the girls in reading and writing, in the language arts, in math and social studies. And I would wager that in every single state, in every single school district, the information is going to be the same. That girls are outperforming the boys. Suspension and expulsion rates for boys much higher than the girls. And then if you disaggregate it by color, and you look at boys of color, our Black boys, our Latino boys, that's really the lowest of the boys. So in our state, they're really looking into how to help our Black boys and young men, because truly they are at the bottom of the boys.
So when you say so their scores were at the lower end is what you're saying, Dr. Greene? Okay.
Absolutely. And again, we don't have the advocacy. If girls were performing as poorly as our boys are, oh my goodness, there would be marches on Washington, marches on every single capital city in the country. Because again, our advocacy groups for girls are very strong, very outspoken, and they are making changes. Unfortunately, our boys are falling by the wayside.
Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Greene, because you bring up great points here, and I'm going to parlay it into what is being talked about. What we've seen all over the news really coming to the forefront in the past 2-3 weeks is not this issue. What we're seeing, this issue of critical race theory that becomes like a political hot potato, particularly not in Maryland necessarily, but in Virginia, right next to where you are, where all of a sudden parents, teachers are coming out, and this is happening all across the country, from blue state Rhode Island to red state Virginia, Florida. Why is that being talked about versus what you've determined as a career educator being one of the functional issues that needs to be addressed?
I tell you, it's just a deflection away from the issues really affecting our children. It's a distraction. Unfortunately, we don't write the narrative. Those of us in education, we don't write the narrative. The narrative is written by people who have another agenda. Critical race theory is a very divisive issue. It has its roots in Marxism.
Right.
I believe that it's a way to undermine the values and the principles that have made our country strong, if people really cared about racial theory and racial equity, then look no farther than the fact of education, not educating our children to the point where they can't read. Look at the effect on the Black family, fatherlessness.
Right.
You know, that has really had a tremendous effect, detrimental effect on Black families. Ever since the policies of LBJ back in the Great Society years of the late 1960s, the Black family has suffered terribly. You know, in the early 1960s, 80% of Black children were raised in two-family homes.
Mm-hmm.
Now that number is probably 20% or less. I saw a number recently where 70 to 73% of Black babies born now are born to single mothers.
Yeah,
that is a recipe for disaster. That is a recipe for disaster because it's in the family that our children are socialized.
Right.
It's in the family, those two parents, where children are supported in their education. And we're looking at the crime rate. Look at our boys, our Black young men in prisons, packing out the prison population. And if you did a survey of those boys, most of them are illiterate. The great majority are illiterate. A great majority come from single-family homes with no father in the home, no role model. That's where the issues are. Black Lives Matter? Yes, Black Lives Matter. Well, how about those Black lives? How about the Black lives of little babies? The abortion rate of Black children, very disproportionate to the number of Black people in our community. 17% of the population, we Black people, but we're over 30-some% or more of the abortions. They're killing our babies, killing our young Black men. Chicago, Baltimore, where our Black men, Black Lives Matter, why aren't you there protesting the fact that our Black young men are dying, that the chances are minuscule of a young Black man in the inner city even reaching the age of 25. That's where the attention needs to be. I'm tired of bleeding heart liberals choosing the issues for Black people to rally behind.
I could not agree with you more.
Ignoring what we really need.
I could not agree with you more. And you know, you were citing some of those statistics, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 80% of the people in our prison system who did not have two parents or complete a high school education, I think that makes up somewhere 75-80% of the population, regardless of your race, in our prison systems. Am I pretty close on that statistic, Dr. Greene?
I believe you are pretty close, Mark, because again, that is what's happening when you have, first of all, like I said, the fatherlessness.
Yep.
When you have little boys trying to be raised by hardworking single mothers who have to have 2 and 3 jobs, who aren't there to raise them. They don't have mentors. They don't have positive role models except the guy on the street corner. You know, that's his role model. So our Black boys are in crisis, not just our Black boys, but all of our boys are in crisis, and no one is sounding the clarion call. We're being distracted by all these other issues that don't really matter and that aren't at the heart of what's wrong.
Well, I'm so happy to hear you say that, because again, it cuts across all lines, whether you're Black, Hispanic, white, it doesn't matter. But one thing is crystal clear is that people that grow up in the United States, if you come from a 2-parent family and get a high school education, your chance of being successful in this country goes up exponentially. Now again, we're not editorializing to stop at high school. No, not at all. But the people that graduate from high school, some go to college, some go on to get a trade. But the fact is, if you just have that basic achievement, it doesn't matter what your background is, you have a chance to live the American dream in the United States. And I agree with you 100%. There's a lot of distractions out there. A lot of it's political. And I think, Dr. Greene, in this upcoming elections, 2022 and 2024, some of these issues are going to be exposed for what they really are. Because when parents have their kids going to school, and I saw some of the fiercest critics of this standing up were African American women and Asian women who were most critical of the sort of indoctrinations that's been going on in our high schools and our colleges, because let's call it for what it is. Most of the professors teaching in college and a great deal of the educators teaching our public schools who are members of the teachers union, they're not exactly conservatives, if we really break it down, is it, Dr. Greene?
No, and unfortunately, they're teaching our young people rather to be victors. They're teaching them to be victims. That you will never succeed because of the white man. The white man will always be an oppressor. You will always be the victim. You will also always be the underdog, and that is straight out of Marxist ideology.
Yeah.
That whole, you have the oppressors and the oppressees. And our black children need to know. And in fact, that was a lesson that my own parents taught me. That, girl, my mom would say, you can be anything you want. You go out here and get yourself a good education, and no one can deny you anything.
That's
and
right.
I look around at how the black community has succeeded. We have black millionaires, black billionaires in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
No other country on this planet have black people succeeded to the levels that they have in the United States of America on American principles and America policies and America's values. Stop attacking my country. I am a proud American. I'm a black American. I don't consider myself an African American. I am a black American. I don't even know some of the countries in Africa. I was born in this country. My parents were born, their parents, and their parents, and their parents. I helped raise this country, and I don't want this 1619 whole theory where they're circling around and they're concentrating on slavery. Yes, slavery was an awful blight on this country.
No
but
question.
Thankfully, our Constitution was such that when that war was fought and the Constitution was changed, we had the principles and we had the godly principles to be able to make the changes in this country that have allowed black people to rise to the tops of many, many professions.
I couldn't agree with
God
you
bless
more.
America.
Absolutely, you're absolutely spot on in your analysis, Dr. Greene. And again, what you're saying is what I think the vast majority of the Americans, other than maybe the 20% of the far left wing of the Democratic Party think. Again, I've said this many, many times. I believe 70% of these people in this country are either center left or center right, and they basically want three things. They want to educate their kids, they want to live in a safe neighborhood, and they want to have a good job where they can work and provide for their family. I mean, there's other things, obviously, but just those three basic things: safety, security, and education. And most people are pretty happy in that circumstance. And yet, again, the far left wing is trying to push this country in a direction that I don't think 70% want to go. So let me stick with a couple other things with you, Dr. Greene. A big issue today came out, okay? A ruling from the Supreme Court that basically was a narrow ruling, folks. So it was 9-0, but it was very narrow. And basically the ruling said this, that college students who are athletic can get compensation, non-cash compensation now, for doing additional educational work, such as computer assistance, tutoring, training, non-cash items. Dr. Greene, do you have an opinion on this that came down from the court today related to students and student athletes in college?
Let me clarify, Mark. You're saying that the Supreme Court said that student athletes are able to be compensated through these other ways?
Yes, non-cash, cannot be cash compensation. The suit was brought by student athletes against the NCAA, and the NCAA had basically said, no, because they're students, they cannot market themselves to get anything beyond what is provided under scholarship. Well, in a 9-0 decision today, the Supreme Court came down and said, no, the NCAA is wrong about that. It violated one of the stipulations that the students, they weren't asking for cash compensation in this piece, but they were asking for the ability to have additional services provided, and they used specific non-cash examples. That's why the opinion was very narrow today, such that student athletes were able to have, for example, extra computer time or something that the university might provide. A lot of people are interpreting this ruling to be, well, they can go out and sell their name as a great footballer, basketballer, track and field star, what have you. That's not what the Supreme Court did. It had nothing to do today with cash payments, but what the concern is that the NCAA has overstepped their bounds in trying to sort of put the cap on what student athletes are able to do from getting compensation beyond their scholarships. And I think that's where the narrowness came down on the view from the court today.
Student athletes do a lot for their colleges. They bring in a lot of money,
yes, they
do.
do.
Through their competition, through sports, millions and millions of dollars coming to those universities on the backs of our student athletes.
Yep.
And many of them are sacrificing even their physical health for their sports. Mm-hmm. I'm not against them getting some compensation. Again, and I'm glad the court said this, I don't like the fact of them getting money, because sometimes that can be used as a, to kind of hold them against them, and they're working so much for the money. But for them to get some kind of compensation, a lot of those student athletes, like I said, have invested, lots and lots of money to get to the point where they are able to compete and be able to truly stand up against some of their peers from other colleges. So to me, it seems like the Supreme Court got it right.
I think so too. And when it's a 9-0 ruling, even if it's narrow, boy, it's hard to argue that one. So I think the NCAA may have overstepped its bounds there. Let me ask you another question, Dr. Greene. A real hot topic that the Biden administration has sort of been deferring is canceling student loan debt. And they're getting a lot of pressure from the left. And we always like to say this on the show: if the Biden administration is doing something correct, we compliment them. If we disagree, we'll criticize them. But in this case, reporting that I'm hearing is they're looking at a couple different avenues. One, possibly forgiving student debt for people who are totally or significantly disabled. Seems like that might be a reasonable proposition. Second thing, possible deferment. Let me make sure I got my notes here. Okay, for people that have worked in public service, there was a provision about 10 years ago saying if you made payments on your student loans and you worked in public service, that you could have part of that forgiven. That seems pretty reasonable to me too. And then the third area was people who had been defrauded by some of these online colleges that they paid for the education, went out of business. That seems pretty reasonable proposal to me too. But Dr. Greene, the left is pushing for way more than that. Give us your thoughts on that, and how is this concept about people can borrow money to go to college, get their education, and then the far left says, well, you don't have to pay it back. Doesn't that just smacks people that paid it back, or people who are taxpayers that chose not to go to college? Maybe they got a trade and they're paying taxes to support a bunch of rich kids that got degrees, and their parents now, they don't want to pay back their education loans. What am I missing here?
I tell you, it's teaching again our young people the fact that you can get something for nothing, which is a dangerous, dangerous path. And I keep thinking of this parent that I saw. I think he was confronting Elizabeth Warren during the campaign, and he says, "Well, wait a minute. I sacrificed and I worked jobs to send my daughter to college.
Yes.
So you're going to let everyone go to college free? Does that mean I get my money back?"
I remember.
You see that?
I did.
There are so many alternatives out there for students to get education. There are work-study programs. There are community colleges. Students can work and go to college. They might not be able to do it in 4 years to get their degree. Mm-hmm. It might take them twice as long. My own husband, he spent 8 years because he worked full-time and went to school full-time. Mm-hmm. So it took him part-time. So it took him a longer time. But he didn't have to go into debt. He didn't have to, borrow from rob Peter to pay Paul. I think it's so unfair that we taxpayers are footing the bill when there are other alternatives for children and students, young people, to get an education. But again, we have to also look at the colleges. My goodness, the prices that they're charging, the pay that they're giving their professors.
It's like a racket.
Educated children at my private school. I educated children for less than $6,000 a year. But oh my goodness, I look at these exorbitant tuition prices that are being charged these young people. But again, they will do it because they can get it. The colleges will charge that amount because they can get it. And unfortunately, some people are taking the bait.
Yeah, and it's almost like I look at some of these colleges, particularly Ivy League schools, that have multi-billion-dollar endowments, and I'm saying, wait a second, okay, I agree with you 100%. These professors are getting paid, whatever they're paid, God bless them. That's their deal with their university. But again, they're getting paid that because students are able to borrow these enormous sums of money, and I'm talking big, sometimes 6 figures of borrowing. And if you get a master's degree, it could be way up there in the 6-figure range. Now, people that are doctors, lawyers, what certain type of occupations, they can borrow and pay it back. But I'm really at a loss of why the left is so hell-bent on having student loans forgiveness. I mean, Warren, Bernie Sanders, they're telling Biden, forgive up to $50,000 a student. And to Biden's credit, he campaigned as a centrist Democrat. So far, he hasn't done anything yet, but he's getting intense pressure from the left on this, Dr. Greene. Why is that pressure so intensified, and why is it coming from the left?
Well, one thing, colleges have become indoctrination centers themselves. That young people who left homes with a certain set of values and beliefs and principles, when they come back from being 4 years in a college where their values are assaulted, their faith is assaulted, they're being made fun of, if they have biblical beliefs or biblical standards, if they even have what are called conservative beliefs, they are made fun of. And, so they have to change their whole way of thinking in order to make the grades, in order to be successful. And in order for colleges to be able to do that to young people, they have to make it possible for them to come. Even if it means them having to borrow the money, make it free if they come, they need to have them for those 4 years or those 6 years so they can truly do a mind game on them.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of evidence of that because, just you look at the voting patterns too. young people, they primarily voted Democrat in the last election. Joe Biden got an overwhelming majority of younger voters, and it's no surprise but when you hand out a lot of free goodies, that tends to happen. Let me shift subject for a second, Dr. Greene. You had, in pre-show, you had said, I'd like to give some comments about what's going on, at our border crisis, and take some time and talk about that, because we talk about that issue a lot, but I want to get it from an educator's perspective, because that, again, is going to have an effect on many, many people coming into this country.
I look at the effect on schools. We have so many children coming in. Many of them are illiterate in their own language. So when they descend upon certain areas, they overwhelm the school. They overwhelm the resources available to that school. They have to be taught English. They have to be given free and reduced meals because, many of them sometimes arriving without their parent.
Yep.
So they have to have a lot of the social systems and welfare systems ready in order to take care of them. But I think what really bothers me is the lesson that they learn from the minute that they come across that border. America is a nation of laws. That is what made America strong. We are a nation of laws. And if the first thing you do, your first introduction to this country, is to break our laws, what does that portend for the future? What is that saying?
Yep.
What is that saying to you? That you can just walk across our border, they say, all right, give us your name, come back on such and such date and we'll go to court. Right.
Yeah.
So if their parents are allowed to be a scofflaw even before they become a citizen, and that sends a terrible message. And it's not just, and I've debated this with some friends who say, well, if things were as bad in our country, I'd want to come into America too. Well, that's fine. But America has a way that it should be done. We have certain processes and procedures that are in place, to make sure that the people who are coming in are going to respect our laws. People coming in are going to be healthy and not bring disease. People who are going to come in are not going to come in and hurt us and raise the crime rate.
Yep.
So we have to respect those laws and to respect those processes. And for the doors just to be blown open, saying, whosoever will, let him come, oh my. And so, I look at our educational system especially because, we love children. Educators love children. We want to help children. But, without the support of having parents who are going to come in and do things the right way, then everything's going to be for naught.
Well, and the other thing, look, like we talked about at the beginning of the show, these kids are at a disadvantage because a lot of times they're coming by themselves or with only one parent. Very rare to two parents and a kid come across. So they're already starting off with the language barrier. They're way behind on the two-parent system. And yet, we do have that responsibility once they're in the United States. You've got to educate them. You can't just leave them there. And again, people really blame Trump for a lot of things, okay? But when you stack up his track record along the border, again, when he left office, we didn't have a border crisis. We didn't have 170,000 people coming across the border every month. Dr. Greene, it's gotten to the point where the governor of Texas, because the federal government is doing nothing, literally nothing to stem this tide, the governor of Texas recently announced that Texas is its citizens are going to have to start constructing border wall or security fencing to protect their own citizens. I mean, Dr. Greene, I've said this on many shows. The people who live in that border of Texas with the Rio Grande border, those used to be deep blue counties. I mean, they were solidly Democrat. Now, in the last election, they voted 40 to 45% Republican, and I would make a small wager that come the 2022 midterms, or certainly in 2024, those people who are living in the zone where everything is happening are saying something's got to be done here, and nothing is being done. The vice president, she was put in charge of the task force. She's never even been there. And it's starting, I think, to become a political anchor around some of these Democrats. Even Democratic congressmen from the area are saying, Mr. Biden, do something down here. And Dr. Greene, it's not happening.
It's not happening. My mother has nurses who come in to assist her from Nigeria, from Cameroon. There's a wonderful lady who comes and helps us with our household chores and things, who's from Honduras. And I've asked them, because I wanted to find out, what do you think about this border crisis? Do you think it's okay for people just to come across the borders? And they have all said, no, it is not right. And I think if you talk to other people who have come here the right way, they say, first of all, it's not fair. One of my mother's nurses, on her break time, she would have her copy of the Constitution sitting on the sofa studying for her citizenship test. Right. She worked hard to become a citizen. She knew facts about the Constitution that I didn't know. And it just showed a respect for our country. Yep. So unfortunately, that has been lost. I'm glad for Texas that they are at least finding the funds. I understood also that mysteriously the work on the border wall was being, kind of resurrected, and I thought that was good news. But this is just a sham. But what I hope, Mark, what I hope happens, that when these people come into our country, who the Democrats think are just going to be future voters, I hope that once they get into this country, that their way of thinking changes. And they realize if you really want to be prosperous in this country, if you really want to be protected in this country, it is not so much the Democrats who are going to do it. You have to look elsewhere for the protections that you want, because you don't want this country to turn to another Marxist socialist country that you came into.
That's exactly
and wouldn't
right.
that be something?
That would be a great outcome. Hey, we got a couple minutes left. I want to give you some time. Talk about the book that you wrote on the boys in this subject, because you're not only an educator, but you're a noted author. So tell our audience about the book, where they can find it, and a little bit about why you decided to write it.
I call it my COVID book, Mark. My family has always said, you do all these workshops and trainings for teachers and administrators. Why don't you write a book? I said, I don't have time to write a book. Well, March of 2020, when they said, you got to stay home, you can't go anywhere, I said, well, you know what? Let's write a book. So my book is entitled, Please Teach Me Like I'm a Boy. And it's written for parents as well as teachers to say, look, stop taking those phone calls over and over again that your son isn't doing this, your son is acting like this, your son can't do this, your son just doesn't behave, he can't focus. Ask those teachers, are you teaching him like he's a boy? Are you asking him to act a certain way, keep his hands folded and not want to get up and move and run and race? Do you realize that when he's wrestling with his friend, he's not fighting, he's just saying hello? That's how boys socialize. That's how boys bond. And so when parents hear these phone calls from their principals and their son's principals and teachers, and they're so disheartened, and they're told, well, maybe he needs to be evaluated. He might need medication. We have healthy little boys who are being labeled ADD, ADHD, ED, and why? Because we have teachers who don't realize that boys learn differently than girls, that you can't expect the same kind of behavior, the same kind of performance from boys as you will girls, because they learn differently, they act differently. And teachers need to realize that they need to adapt their instruction, adapt their classroom environment to be more boy-friendly, because if our boys are in trouble, so are we all.
Dr. Greene, and these things we've talked about today, it's socioeconomic, and it leads to a stronger country, because the better educated our kids are as a country, whether it's through grade school, high school, college, or postgraduate work, the better country we're going to have, because the more highly educated the citizens in your country, the better your country's going to do. Dr. Greene, you got a minute left. Close it out with your vision of where you'd like to see things going over the next 6 months to a year, and how do you see where we are now and where this country should be going?
I would like to see parents whose eyes were awakened to how their children are being taught, what is being taught. They had their eyes open when they were home looking over their son and daughter's shoulder at that computer and saying, oh my goodness, is that what they're teaching you? I hope that parents will continue to go before school boards to challenge what is being taught and how it's being taught. I hope that parents will go before legislators. That's what we're trying to do at the Boys Initiative. We want to equip parents, because when they go before those legislators or go before those school boards, they need facts. They need statistics, not just emotion, to tell them that things need to change. We want to see more people become advocates for our boys, because truly there is a boy crisis. We need to see data being truthfully reported, a narrative showing that our boys are not doing as well as our girls. That doesn't mean the girls have to do worse. It just means that we need to help our boys to do better, and it can be done. I would love people to pick up a copy of my book so they can educate themselves, to give a copy to your son's teacher to say, please teach him like he's a boy. I would love for people to come and check out theboysinitiative.org, subscribe to our newsletter where you can get information, join one of our community networks. We have a network for the faith community, for mothers of sons, for teachers of boys, where we want you to join forces with each other for our boys. They need your advocacy.
Dr. Vermelle, Greene, I could not be happier to have had you on my show today. You bring a perspective that really is new and refreshing, and I cannot thank you enough, and I know our audience is really going to appreciate your commentary today. Please come back often. I'd love to have you back, and I know our audience will. Folks, I will close it out with a couple comments today that really go beyond the education pace. One, polling out today shows that north of 75% of Americans, there's a lot of talk about this voter ID and voter laws. 75 pushing 80% of Americans want people to be able to vote and provide voter ID. So put that away when you're hearing all this stuff in the media about what's really going on. Second thing I want to leave with closing today, we've talked about this infrastructure bill a lot. I think they're going to come up with a bipartisan bill. We said it last week, and I think right now, you've got maybe 22, 24 agreements among Republican and Democratic senators. If they can keep it as a true infrastructure bill, I think that could be a good thing. It could help bring the country together a little bit. Anyhow, Dr. Greene, thank you again for joining us today. My pleasure. I want to thank our audience for being with us today. Stay safe out there, and we will cover some more issues tomorrow. Have a good evening. We'll see you soon.